Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on today's SAP Business One user group session. I'm James Rodder, and today's focus is on peripheral purchase documents within SAP Business One. So what we'll go through is a few slides just to give you a bit of an understanding of what we're talking about when we're saying peripheral purchase documents. So when we say peripheral documents within the purchasing workflow, are those types of documents that you may see on the SAP Business One menu that sits outside of the typical purchase order, goods receipt purchase order, AP invoice. So, through our experience, very generalized statement, but, from our experience, most businesses would be familiar with that workflow within SAP Business One. Now, and that's typical for, when you purchase local goods and you have trading terms or on-account trading terms with that supplier that you purchase that goods or services from. Now, there is another set of documents that sit outside of those three documents, which can extend the capabilities of the purchasing workflow, which may introduce additional team members as part of the procurement process, so you can get greater transparency and accuracy with the purchasing process. Also, some of these documents can improve your supplier's performance by keeping them accountable and keeping the communication nice and clear. So when you put a request through for to purchase some goods and services, they're very clear of what you're requiring. There's also documents that have subtle differences or significant differences with the postings into the financial system. So we'll look into that. And also how to handle expenses related to the purchasing workflow that we can incorporate and capitalize those expenses to give you accuracies around costing. All right, so that's just an overview, but what we'll go through now before we actually drill into the system is just an explanation of each of these documents that I'll be covering today. Now, the first one is the purchase request, also known as a purchase requisition. So the purchase request is the very first document in the purchasing flow. The purpose of it is to gather the requirements within your organization to then feed it to the purchasing department. So individuals across marketing, sales, outside of the purchasing team can then feed data into that team in a clear workflow. So the data can be captured precisely and understand what the requirements are to drive that demand and get the supply in from your suppliers. So we'll cover the purchase request. The next one we'll cover is a purchase quotation. So this is where prior to sending a purchase order, you'll send a request through to your supplier, which will be a quotation, giving them an understanding of what products and services that you're after, what the expected units that are required, and some timeframes for them to then respond prior to actually committing to the order, but respond with the pricing that they'll give you, the terms like payment terms, what the availability is of those goods and services, and a commitment around when the goods can be delivered. So that purchase quote can be sent to them, and you can get commitments before sending that purchase order. So this will reduce the number of times that you would have to cancel purchase orders or anything like that, because you've sent them earlier notice of what your requests are going to be. So that's the idea of the purchase quotation. The next document that we'll cover is the AP reserve invoice. Now, this is typically used in a situation where you're importing goods from an overseas supplier, where they will send you the goods and X works, or when it's being departed from the foreign port, they'll send you the invoice to expect payment of. So while the goods are in transit or on the water, when you post a reserve invoice, it's handling the financial movements to recognize that that stock is now yours. So we'll cover that and show you how that's easily incorporated into the workflow within purchasing. The next set of documents we'll discuss is the AP down payment invoice and request. Now, this is where you have a situation with your supplier where they will expect payment prior to dispatching the goods, or a deposit or a prepayment on that consignment, or that request for goods before they'll manufacture it or dispatch it from their warehouse. So there is a subtle difference between an invoice and a request, and to do with timing and, again, how the financial postings are handled within SAP Business One, which we'll go through. And this can be then, again, included as part of the core workflow, and the system will automatically recognize that there are prepayments and draw down on that prepayment when the goods are actually received and then finally invoiced. So we'll cover that today as well. The last document that we'll cover is landed costs. So landed costs, if you, again, import goods, you may already be familiar with this, but the whole purpose of landed costs is if you're receiving, you are bringing goods into your warehouse and there are costs from third parties involved in getting those goods to your doorstep. You want to capitalize or spread the cost or those expenses to get those goods onto your doorstep, to give you a accurate landed cost, which will then in turn, based on stock valuations and a few other things, will become your cost of sales. So this allows to distribute the revenue and the costs to the right periods, rather than handling all the expense in the period that you receive the goods. So there's a few considerations around using landed costs, but again, if you are importing goods already, you may already be familiar with this. So those are the documents that we're going to cover today. What I'll do now is go through a few scenarios within SAP Business One. So I'll move across to the system. Bear with me. And now we're in SAP Business One. So I'm in the HANA version today, but what we're going to cover is applicable for both the Microsoft SQL version and the SAP HANA version. So we'll be focusing on the purchasing module today, and when I expand that, you'll see a whole suite of options here. So again, most of those users that are familiar with SAP, you'll be familiar with raising a purchase order, creating a goods receipt purchase order, and then when the supplier sends you the invoice, you'll process the AP invoice. But there's a few other documents here that you might want an explanation on what they're doing, what they do, and that's why you're here today. So let's jump into a purchase request. So when we open up the purchase request, it's a typical document, look and feel of a document within SAP Business One. But up the top left, rather than seeing the supplier's information, the business partner's information, you're seeing the requester. So the purpose of this is that someone throughout the organization can enter this, and that will be, I guess, a source of demand within the organization for then the purchasing department to procure those goods and services. So what I'll do, I'll change this from a user, and then we'll allocate it to an individual. And what we'll do is I'll grab Kevin Lewis, who's part of the marketing department. So I can see the information here. He's part of the Sydney branch in the marketing department. That flows through from the HR record. Then we've also got this option here to send an email to Kevin if this purchase request gets converted to a purchase order or a goods receipt purchase order. So, if this purchase request does get approved to be procured, Kevin will automatically know once it gets converted to a purchase order, knowing exactly, which supplier it's going to be purchased from and delivery dates and a few things. So that's something that can be configured and sent to Kevin using the SAP Business One mailer. On the right-hand side, we have our typical dates, but what's important here is that Kevin would then feed in when he requires these goods by. So what Kevin will do, he wants to push helmets. He wants plenty of helmets to be available during the month of December. So just like what you'll be familiar with, we can search the catalogue of items within SAP. He wants to purchase the whole range of helmets or request the range of helmets. From there, we can then key in the units required. So what Kevin requires is 100 of each, which I'll quickly feed in. It will provide pricing that's already in the system. However, if Kevin's already done some work and negotiated new pricing for this particular campaign for marketing, that's just one scenario. You can update that. And also the vendor, based on the item setup, it will then default the main supplier in here. So what you'll see here is one purchase request, but multiple vendors can be allocated in one screen. So this just keeps Kevin's job easy. He just wants the helmets. He doesn't, probably not too concerned where they're purchased from, or he might be, but really depends. But the demand is put in, and then what can happen here is that gets added to the system for then the purchasing team to gather that to then either decline the request or convert that to a purchase order or purchase request. So that is the entry of the purchase request. Nothing too extraordinary if you're already familiar with SAP Business One. It's just the concept that this is coming from within the team. They don't have privileges to raise purchase orders, but they can put a request through in the system to make sure the data is in accurately. There's no miscommunication or anything like that of exactly what your team member needs. So from there, what will happen is that the purchasing team will get a notification of that purchase request. That can happen in a number of ways. We can set up alerts and messages within SAP to go to the right set of team members to be aware of that request. Alternatively, there are reports. So under Open Items List, there is a view here to see all the open purchase requests, and I can see that purchase request there from Kevin with the required date and the total balances. So that's one way of having knowledge that the request is in the system. Another method is using the purchase request report, which we'll go through. This allows the purchasing team to see what's in the system as far as purchase requests, but then also convert them to the subsequent document, either being a purchase quote or purchase order. So there's a set of parameters here that you can use to define what purchase requests you want to look into. However, for this today, I'm just going to select everything that's open, which is just the one purchase request that I've just raised. And this is the view that comes out. So I see all the products and information that was keyed into that request, and I can then make decisions from here and convert them to subsequent documents. At the moment, this document or this report is grouped by item, but what I can do is I can then group this by vendor, and I can see a clearer view of what sort of purchase orders and requests that I can send out. So for the one request, it looks like I've got a total of 5 suppliers that I would need to engage with. And what we can do is simply tick the box on the left-hand side. So I'll unselect a couple. I'll unselect the top 2. And let's say the bottom 3 suppliers with the 5 items, I'm going to release those directly to a purchase order. So down the bottom right, I can now go create, and I've got the option of purchase quotes or purchase orders. What I'm going to do for this first workflow is convert that to a purchase order. So once I've done this, this is a one-off thing. It's converting the content that I've flagged in the request to become a purchase order. I hit yes on that. Down the bottom there, we can see that the purchase orders have been created for each of those purchase request lines, and then these lines grey out. So if I go back into the purchase request, I can see those lines have now been greyed out because they've been converted to a purchase order. Kevin will now be notified that those items have been converted to a purchase order. As always, I can go to the relationship map, and I can see that the one purchase request has been converted into 3 purchase orders. So you can see some efficiencies there. One document being able to convert it to multiple purchase orders without too much strain. Now, the alternate way of actually doing this is within the purchase request, I can now go right click and go purchase request report directly from the purchase request. And that will take me to that same report. But this time it will only show me what's open. So for this scenario, I'm going to choose this line here, and I'm going to convert that to a purchase quotation. Same prompt as before. And then down the bottom left, I can see that purchase quotation number 12 has been created. So I won't jump into that just yet. I just want to go through one other scenario around converting a request into a quotation, just to show why you would use quotations. But just to round off purchase requests, that is it. It is a means for the team to feed in that information directly into the purchasing department to quickly convert that to a subsequent purchasing document in that workflow. Very precise, all the notifications and awareness of that are taking place automatically handled by the system. All right, so if I refresh that, I can see that we've got a couple lines open, which what I'll do is handle that via a purchase quotation generation wizard. So if I go into this option here, so if I go into purchase quotation first and go to my last record, we'll see that this purchase request number 12, quotation number 12 was created. And I see that we have the green helmet for a quantity of 100. So what happens from here is that this will get sent via email to the supplier for them to respond. You've sent them, hey, I need a green helmet. I require 100 by the 7th of December. What can you do for me? So the intention is that the supplier will then respond and say, okay, well, to give you the best pricing possible, we can give you 200. We can dispatch it to you by the end of this week, and we'll give you a price of $55 on that. So that is fed into the system. No commitment at this point. You haven't sent them a purchase order. They've just provided you with information to go to make a decision on, if you would like to go ahead with that green helmet. So, is that the price that you were expecting? Maybe there are other suppliers that you could talk to about green helmets and see if they can get closer to the quantity and maybe reduce the price. A few things. So, there's a balancing act around these decisions. And this is one way of handling it, just one engagement. Now, if you want to handle a situation where you do want to sort of almost go to market and say, hey, I want to compare multiple suppliers for procuring this particular item, this is the purchase quotation generation wizard. So this takes the content of a underlying document and then explodes that into a multiple purchase quotes. So then the quotes can be compared once all the suppliers have been respond. So if you're familiar with wizards, it's a next, and as you go through, it will ask a set of questions. So what I'll do here, I'll go next on the first screen, and I'll create a new set of parameters for this particular wizard. So I'll go purchase request for November 18. That's all required there. I then go next, and then I have a selection criteria to do it based on items. So I can just go to the item catalog and do purchase quotations without any demand or purchase requests in the system. Alternatively, I can actually raise it based on a purchase request, which I'll do. And there's a range of parameters here to then filter down which purchase requests we want to convert into purchase quotes. Based on those parameters, it will return the purchase request that fit that criteria. And I see that green helmet has come through, and that that should say white, but that says wow helmet come through. And this is what the purchasing person will go through to understand, okay, what purchase quotes do I want to release? We then go next. And what it's done is then looked into those items and looked at both the all the preferred suppliers based on the items set up. So if I change this grouping and I want to group it by item, I can see that the white helmet can be purchased from 3 suppliers and the green helmet can be purchased from these 3 suppliers. So just quickly, I'll drill into the suppliers, the item setup, and under purchasing data, I can see the preferred vendor field, and I can drill on this button here, and I can see those 3 preferred suppliers set up. So if that's all set up, it makes the purchase quotation generation work a lot cleaner. What I'll do, I'll only run this process for the white helmet. So I've just highlighted that top section, and then I can go next. It's previewing the results that I'm about to commit, and then I go next, and what I can do is just execute that. All right, so it's given the summary at the end of this process has told me that there are 3 purchase quotations, 13, 14, and 15 that have been created. So just like before, when I just sent one out, the whole idea here is that each of these suppliers will return with their response. And what will happen was that we'll compare those. So let's just quickly feed some data in as if they have responded. So let's say Octane has said, okay, well, I can give you 100. We can get it to you by, say, the 5th of December at $55. So that's the first one that's come back. The same purchase group. So you'll see if I go back that there's a grouping number here, 7008. If I go to the next purchase quotation, so I'm moving to purchase quotation number 14, it's under that same grouping. So that's how the system recognizes that these are all part of that same purchase quotation generation wizard scenario. So future 4 has returned and said, okay, well, I can get you 200 and we can dispatch it by the end of this week. And we'll give you a price of, say, $40. And then the last one is $100. They're giving us the unit of a quantity of 100. They're not going to make the 7th of December, so we'll make it the 12th. But they'll probably get, they'll give us the best price. All right. So what will happen now is, all that data is fed into the system. The suppliers have got back to you. They've been very diligent and good and got back to you in a timely fashion. And what the purchasing officer will do is run this purchase quotation comparison report. So what this does, if I open this up, it allows me to quickly compare those responses in that purchase quotation scenario. So I've got the white helmets, and I can see the system has indicated the more desirable results. So, this one from Lightman Group, the price here is the most attractive, but then they can't get it to us until the 12th of December. Future 4, it's got an okay price, they've come second, and they can get it to us on the desirable date, and they can give us a quantity of 200 by that date. And then the last one is Octane, and that's, nothing that screams out. They haven't won anything, but, it's a reasonable proposition. So what will happen is someone will make the call, which particular response we'll go ahead with. And what you simply do, I'll go with the future 4. They'll get it to us in a timely fashion. The pricing isn't too bad, and they'll get us 200. I highlight that, so the record is highlighted, and then down the bottom there, I can create the purchase order. and that's done. So that will close off the other quotes. So that workflow is completed. So the other two quotes will be closed. They weren't successful. You might want to go back to the supplier and say, unfortunately, we've gone to another supplier for this particular request for quote. Try again next time. But that's all about, you know, keeping your supplier's performance as high as possible by, you know, being clear with your expectations, being aware of what sort of demand that you have, and making sure that, you know, when it comes to your request, they can give you the best proposition possible. So if I go to the purchase order, I can see that this Future 4 incorporated has been converted into a purchase order for the 200 at that price. I can see all the remarks information here. If I open up the relationship map, this is going to show a lot of documents, but you know, the system is all tracking this information. So the one purchase request has created a group of purchase quotations, and ultimately 4 purchase orders have been released as a result of that purchase request. So Kevin, the guy from marketing, will be informed of all these activities once they've been converted to a purchase order. All right, so that's what I wanted to go through for purchase requests and purchase quotations. Hopefully that gives you an understanding. Now what we'll go through is the AP reserve invoice. And what I'll do here, I'll create a new purchase order for Far East imports. Now, as I was saying earlier, when it comes to reserve invoice, this is generally where you have goods on the water or goods in transit, and you, the organization, own those goods. They sit on your balance sheet. Very typical when the transit time is, you know, extended to, I guess, justify going through this workflow. So it's very similar to what you would be already familiar with, converting it directly to an AP invoice, but there's an option here for reserve invoice. So what we'll do is we'll key in this purchase order for Far East imports, and what we want from these from Far East imports is some computers. So I'll select those computers, add them to the purchase order, and you'll notice that this is a US supplier, and we'll key in, well, that wasn't correct, 50, 50, 50, and 50. And what we'll see on the right hand side here is that the total balance, or the total amount for the purchase order, is 68,000 US dollars. I can add that to the system. That gets sent to Far East Imports. They will start, dispatching those goods, or they might need to be manufactured. There can be a range of scenarios, but you know, if you are on FOB terms, you take possession, you take ownership of the goods as soon as they hit the water or in transit. They will send you an invoice for those goods, and you need to process them to recognize that they are now your possession. So down the bottom right, which I hope you're familiar with, is the copy to, and you have the option of a goods receipt purchase order, AP invoice, and what we're going to go through is the reserve invoice. So when I process this, when I select that, just like what we're always familiar with, it will carry the content of that purchase order into the reserve invoice, and this will allow us to type in the AP invoice information. But this is just under reserve invoice. This is just how the system's going to handle this workflow. So up the top left, I'll type in the supplier's invoice number, posting date as always, the due date of payment, other information here, and all the information filtering through. So when I process this, what we'll do, and I'll just show the journal preview, it will put the balance, so we'll see that it credits accounts payable, but rather than going into stock on hand or goods received not invoiced, it's going into an account called stock in transit. So it sits on your balance sheet under assets as your goods. but you haven't taken receipt of them yet. So, we haven't talked about, we haven't entered any serial numbers, batch tracking information, if they're tracked in that particular way. All we're doing is recognize that we have taken ownership of these goods. So if I hit add on this, that's been entered in the system. That can now be processed. We can process an outgoing payment against this reserve invoice. It all works perfectly fine. Just like most GL documents, this updates the GL, therefore it's locked. But since this is still part, the goods are still in transit, it still gives us the ability to update the delivery date. So, at the moment, the delivery date is set to today. However, they've informed us, there's been some issues. We can change the delivery date on the reserve invoice, and that still updates, the available to promise report. So I can see that this, the entry here for Far East Imports, that we had an order date of the 27th and the delivery date is the 30th because I updated on the reserve invoice. So, if you're doing this on a purchase order, currently, you have that ability, but you also have this ability if you post the AP reserve invoice to keep those dates in check to drive reporting such as available to promise. So just to finalize this, so let's say the goods are now arrived. I can now go into the AP reserve invoice. This is key, and now convert this into a goods receipt purchase order. So all that information has come across from that reserve invoice. I can process this. I'm receipting it all. If there's any back orders or short shipments or anything like that, I can see that it's being moved from stock in transit to stock on hand, and that drives the financial movements and that can be dispatched. So that's the reserve invoice process. Just flipping it around from purchase order to goods receipt purchase order to purchase order reserve invoice and then goods receipt. All right, so that's that workflow. The next one is the down payment documents. So what I'll do again is raise a new purchase order. And this is when we have a scenario where we have a foreign supplier, and before they start manufacturing the goods or anything like that, they require a deposit, some security that you're going to proceed with this particular order. So Lasercom have those terms. Oh, didn't get that quite right. Just give me a second. Lasercom. So it's a foreign supplier again, and what we want to purchase from Lasercom is a handful of road bikes. So these items have to be manufactured. Therefore, they're going to need deposits or some sort of security to go ahead with that. So that is a what if that might not apply to you, but this is I guess why you would use the first type of down payment document, which is a down payment request. So you'd key the purchase order in, you'd send that to Lasercom, they'll come back to you and say, okay, in order for us to go ahead with this, we need a deposit, a security deposit. So this is where it gets a bit different from other purchasing workflows. What you need to do is go into either the down payment request or down payment invoice, and this time I'll go down to a down payment request. I type in Lasercom. And then down the bottom, it's prompting me for exchange rate information. So if I want to update the exchange rates or anything like that, I can do that as part of drawing down from the purchase order. But the content has come through. Now, the content here doesn't really change. What's important is down the bottom right is, what is the down payment amount that they're expecting, the deposit amount. And what they've said is that we expect a 15% deposit for to go ahead with manufacturing these items. So you type in the 15%, and it ends up being $8,900 US. I can add that to the system. So what this then allows is that it allows for the outgoing payment to be processed. So if I now go into the banking module and go to outgoing payments, I can then bring up Lasercom, and I can see that amount there. So we haven't received the invoice yet or anything like that. We're just giving them a security deposit. If you have that sort of scenario, I can process this. So I'll just choose a bank, copy balance due, and process like this, like any other outgoing payment, but it's going against a down payment request. So if I back out of this and go back to the purchase request, I can see now it's closed because it's been paid. If I go back to our trusty relationship map, I can see that the purchase order was converted to a down payment request, and now we've got an outgoing payment against that for the deposit. So the supplier receives those funds, starts manufacturing those goods, same workflow that what we've done previously. The purchase order here, so I'm back at the purchase order, can either be converted to a goods receipt purchase order, an AP invoice, or a reserve invoice. This time I'll convert it to an AP invoice. So this is, again, what you'd be familiar with. But down the bottom right here, you'll see that there's a down payment amount automatically allocated to that AP invoice, because the system recognizes that that deposit was part of that workflow, and now you receive the AP invoice. I'm going to automatically allocate that balance to this. So we have then a remaining balance of the $50,000. So that's that workflow. Down payment request, or security deposit from an overseas supplier. We process that, it ties into the purchasing workflow and automatically allocates those funds. So that's the request. The alternate to this is that purchase down payment invoice. So very similar, but rather than us receiving a request for a deposit or anything like that, we've actually received the invoice. I'm going to go insurance, and then I'm going to change it to a service document. So this is us raising a purchase order, say for the year's worth of insurance. Just picking up the GL. So this is a service document this time around, but this applies to item documents as well. So if I go annual insurance, and I'll say that's $24,000 for the year. So purchase order raised, again, hopefully you're familiar with this, but this time a service purchase order. That's now in the system, and very similar to what we had to do before, we then drill into the down payment invoice screen. I select the supplier, so that was insurance, Humongous Insurance. I then do a copy from purchase order. I have to change this to service, and then do a copy from, and then I see that amount there. Same prompt as before. This is a local supplier, so that's fine. So I've received the tax invoice from Humongous Insurance, but I want to treat it as a prepaid purchase because I want to defer the expense or something like that. So it's not going, I specified insurance on the purchase order. So that's where ultimately where it will be expensed to. But when I raise the AP down payment invoice, generally down the bottom, we would treat it as 100%. So this is very similar to the request that, you specify what the down payment amount is, and this is going to be 100%. I add that to the system. I should have put an invoice number there, but it doesn't really matter. I then can go back through that workflow. that I did previously. Open up banking, process that down payment amount. So again, if I go insurance, I can see that amount there for $26,000. I pay that just like any other AP invoice. And then it's been processed. So then it becomes an internal decision on when I want to convert that prepaid expense into the actual or prepaid purchase into the actual insurance expense. So I'll see, I'm back into this purchase order. It's still open. If I go to the relationship map, I can see that it was converted to a down AP invoice. This is an internal decision on when you want to release it to the actual insurance expense. So, if it was the next month or anything like that, I can defer it to the next month. I can see down the bottom right that the total amount is 24K. The total down payment is 24K. Therefore, there's actually no amount against this AP invoice because it was already been paid for. But if I go to the journal entry preview screen, you'll see that it's credited it from prepaid purchases and then put it into insurance expense. So it's all around deferring the expense for the down payment invoice generally. You can use it for similar to what I used for the request, a deposit. If the supplier said, okay, I need a 10% deposit, you have to treat it as an invoice. So it's, there's GST implications and those sort of things to be to think of. But that is generally the process. What I find is 100%, you defer the expense. When you want to convert it to the actual expense in the right period, you'll convert the purchase order into an AP invoice. There's no movement on the AP side, but it moves it from the prepaid or prepayments into the actual expense account on your P&L. All right, so those are the two down payment documents. The last document I'll go through is the landed costs. So this is the scenario where we've imported goods. There are third-party expenses that we'd like to incorporate into that particular purchasing workflow to give us an accurate landed cost. And if you're using either FIFO or average costing, or actual batch or serialized costing, it would update that value as far as a cost that would then eventually become your cost of sale amount. Standard cost is a bit different. It'd be variances if there is a discrepancy, but those are just things to consider behind the scenes. But as far as the workflow here, what we're going to do is process that reserve invoice workflow. So that was for Far East imports. And what we do here is then again do a copy from goods receipt purchase order. I can see all the goods receipt purchase orders in the system. I'll go to the last one that I just processed today for the computers. And now it's a case of capturing or gathering those costs related to getting those goods to your doorstep, to your warehouse. So this first items tab shows us the contents of that goods receipt purchase order with the US values and a range of other values here. So I can see what the US currency values are. If I want to change it to AUD, I can then change it up the top left and see what the warehouse price is at the moment based on that exchange rate of 80 cents and a few other things. But now what we'd like to do is add additional costs to getting that. So that could be duties, that could be storage, obviously the freight, if there were any insurances, anything like that. We can now apply those costs to this goods receipt purchase order that we processed. So when we set up, we can have as many different landed cost types, and at the moment I've set the system up based on the type of expense. This could be a range of suppliers that you use, a combination of the two, both the suppliers that you use and the nature of the expense. But once you define that list, it's then a decision on how you allocate or distribute these expenses across your lines. And I've got a few examples here of, I can spread it based on the cash value, the weight, the quantity, or an equal distribution. So I'll go back to items now. You'll see these values here, expenditure and allocated cost value. And you'll see other attributes such as quantity and weight and alike. So what I'll do, I'll key in, say, $1,000 was related to cartage. And then if I go back to items, I can see how it's distributed that $1,000 based on weight. So we see that the top three items all have a shared weight of 200 kilograms and the bottom two is 150. You can see that it's distributed at a unit price. So $4.44 for the top three and $3.33. That's going to increase the landed cost of these items, and then we can see these values here. So that's one way of distributing the cost. If I change it and do it based on quantity, now since it was all the same quantity of 50, every item gets that same distribution. So this is just a question of, based on the nature of the products that you bring in, are they very heavy or they take up a lot of space? If you've got a container that comes in, it's generally done by volume or a range of things. You would set up these types of landed costs to then figure out the distribution of those costs. I then have other options here. I can see which vendors have been involved. I can go to the details and then specify if this new landed cost or warehouse price should update my last purchase price, another purchase price, or do not update a price list. So, when you're reviewing, what did it cost previously? Do you want it to be the landed cost to be your purchase price or the last supplier purchase price? So that's a few decisions there. I also have the option here if I do want to distribute the expense across these lines. So if I go no on that first one and go back to items, it will then remove that first line from the distribution of the costs. So that's just a bit of an extra bit of configurability around the landed costs. I have a general tab which will eventually update with the journal entry, and then we have attachments. So if I now add that to the system, those items that on the goods receipt purchase order have now been revalued. If I go back to that general tab, I'll see there's a transaction number. You'll see that stock on hand has increased by $200 per item. So it's inflated the cost of those items to give us an accurate cost. And then I see this entry here for fumigation clearing of $1,000. So what happens there is that then when you actually process the AP invoice from your fumigation supplier, you will draw down on this clearing account. You won't re-expense it. You'll draw down from this liability. So this is sitting on the balance sheet at the moment to process that supplier invoice. So with landed costs, there are always challenges around the timeliness of receiving these supplier costs and a few things like that. So, keep your suppliers honest and make sure they get you these invoices related to landed costs to you as soon as possible, so you can process this to then give your products an accurate landed cost. All right, so that was what we were covering today. Hopefully you've gives you a bit of a sense of what we deemed as peripheral documents. Obviously that's very subjective and it really depends on the industry you're in, if they're peripheral or not. But gives you a sense of the scenarios that you can use purchase requests and bring more people into the purchasing workflow. Raising purchase quotes, getting keeping that supplier performance as optimal as possible. Keep getting them aware of what demand is going to come their way, pricing and volumes that you're going to commit to. Reserve invoices, again, if you're importing goods, you'll find that very useful, that you can actually process the supplier's invoice prior to receipt of those goods, to then keep the books up to date. Down payment documents, if you have to handle scenarios of putting deposits down before receiving any tax invoice information, but you want to tie it into that workflow, they are good documents to think of using, just to tie everything up nicely. And then also using landed costs, rather than expensing those costs related to getting those goods to your warehouse, increase the cost of your items to give you more accuracy around what margins you're making on your products and alike. Okay, so thank you for attending today. If there are any questions as a result to this, please don't hesitate to contact us through our support desk. They'll have a range of questions. If you have a range of questions, they should be able to field them. Speak to your consultant that you normally talk to as well, deal with as well, because every site is being configured slightly differently, and there might be other considerations that need to be factored in before you adopt any of these types of documents. Okay, so again, thanks for your time this morning. I hope you found that useful, and we'll talk again soon.